And I'd like to welcome everybody today to Soil Testing 101 with Jeff Nimmo, our regional agrologist for the Kootenays with the BC Ministry of Agriculture. Thank you everybody for joining today. I did want to say at the beginning that we will do a roundtable introductions before we start the official presentation. So we know who's in the room today and we get a sense of what questions people might have about soil testing as well. So once again, thank you for attending Soil Testing 101. My name is Rachel. I coordinate the Kootenay and Boundary Farm Advisor Program, and I'll be your host. And today, as part of the Kootenay and Boundary Farm Advisor team, we also have Danny Smart. Give us a wave. She's helping us with technology today, and she's also a general advisor with Kootenay Boundary Farm Advisors, and Andrew Bennett, if he can give a wave as well. I don't know where he is on my Brady Bunch screen, but also a general advisor with the Kootenay Boundary Farm Advisors. The Kootenay Boundary Farm Advisors is an agricultural extension program that provides free information and resources to producers in the Kootenay and Boundary region. This program is funded by the Regional District of Kootenay Boundary, Central Kootenay, the Regional District of East Kootenay, and Columbia Basin Trust. Kootenay Boundary Farm Advisors, we don't work in isolation though. We do work very closely with the BC Ministry of Agriculture to help extend their resources and expertise that are relevant to our local producers. And we really enjoy that relationship of hearing what questions producers have, and if the ministry has resources that are relevant, we go back and forth and help and connect producers to those resources. And soil testing is certainly one of those areas that we do a lot of that in, because soil testing is consistently a theme that we get a lot of questions about. Kootenay and Boundary Farm Advisors, we have held previous events on the subject, including Zooms on soil health and field days, but we thought a refresher on the topic is a good idea. And our presenter today, Jeff Nimmo, is also our region's new regional agrologist, and he's based in Creston. So basically, this is a good opportunity to introduce Jeff, and he can speak to soil nutrient management at the same time. So thank you, Jeff, for attending today. After this event, we are going to be sending up a follow-up email that I will include a few additional resources of some of those previous Zooms that we talked about. In attendance today is Mike Malmberg. He's given a presentation before on soils of the East Kootenay. We also have a fabulous recording of soils of the Central Kootenay that was from 2 years ago. So after this event, see it as like a primer for then getting a little bit more information about soils and nutrient management for agricultural soils in the Kootenays. At the end of our presentation today, we are going to have lots of time for questions and answers. So if you have specific questions about your soil test in particular, save those to the end, and we're just going to stay online and you can pick apart those questions that you have. And without further ado, before I hand the controls over to Jeff, I will ask people to introduce themselves. So actually, Jeff, do you want to stop sharing your screen for 1 second? Because then I can see the names in a grid. Yeah, that's great. Thank you. And Mike, let's start with you. You're at the top of my screen. Oh, you're on mute.
Sorry, there we go. Sorry about that. Technical glitch already. Yeah, my name is Mike Malmberg. I'm a retired agrologist. I used to do the regional agrologist chair, but from the Cranbrook area some time ago. Anyway, I live at Fort Steele. My wife and I operate a small farm here. We do intensive grazing right now. We used to do vegetables and actually laying hens for a period of time. Looking forward to Jeff's presentation, and glad to be here.
Thanks, Mike. And Tracy Zelke.
Can everyone hear me? Oh. So I am over in Fruitvale, and I am going into year 3 of flower farming. And I had contacted you a while back about soil testing. And so I've been getting my soil tested actually twice a year right now, so I can see the direct impacts of what I'm doing. But I would love to get a better understanding of what I'm reading and, you know, just what is the normal? Do I do it once a year? And yeah, so I'm really looking forward to this because I'm quite new in the farming industry.
Great, thanks for joining today, Tracy. And Tara.
My name's Tara. I am up in Hills, which is the north end of Spokane Lake, and I am going into my second year of flower farming. And yeah, I find the soil testing thing kind of intimidating, but very important. So I'm looking forward to the information today.
Great, thanks, Tara. Thanks for joining. And Frank.
Okay, I don't know. Are you hearing me?
Yeah,
okay.
Loud and clear.
Okay, wasn't sure I had it on or not. So I live in the Deer Park area above Castlegar. Been having a small orchard and farm for the last almost 40 some years now. Big garden, and have done numerous soil tests, a few leaf analyses too, but wouldn't mind learning a little bit more, and mostly how to test on my own. So that's good for it now.
Great, thanks, Frank. And if anyone in the audience has questions about fruit trees and horticulture, Frank's your guy. You have an incredible orchard. And Sarah.
From Golden. Yeah, hi. Yeah. So I'm here in Golden. I see a couple of colleagues from Kiefer Ecological Services on the call today, where I work as environmental scientist. And I also have a newly establishing 6-acre berry and nut farm that I'm putting together, but it's a long-term game. Nice to see you all.
Yeah, and thanks for joining today, Sarah. And I know that you're also an environmental farm plan advisor now.
I have done about half the training. I have to get through the on-farm stuff.
Great. So we all sort of work together from different peripheries. So it's nice to see you in person today. Yeah. Or I guess not in person. Zoom person. And no one else has their video on, so I'll just start picking names, and you can also just chime in. How about, Drew, perfect, you put your video on. It's easy.
Yes. Good morning, everyone. I'm a coworker of Jeff's. I'm the regional agrologist for Metro Vancouver, and just found out about this webinar yesterday. So I had some time on my calendar and figured I'd jump in and use it for some professional development. So nice to see everyone this morning.
Great, nice to meet you, Drew. And Elizabeth. Oh, we can't hear you actually. And it doesn't show the muted thing, so maybe your computer is bunked. Well, I can paraphrase. I think you grew up in Creston and you work for Bayer Crop Science now in Cranbrook. Wow, I'm going from my memory here. All right, I'll go over to Madeline, and if you can figure it out, then I'll circle back. So thanks. And Madeline?
Hi, my name is Madeline. Everyone calls me Maddie, and I just bought a 4-acre property on the outskirts of Fernie, BC. So super, super cold. And I started a little garden center where I sell my plants in soil blocks instead of plastic pots, and I sell bare root trees and bushes instead of the ones that are grown more traditionally with sprays and shipped around in their big pots. So I'm just trying to be more environmentally friendly. I have never tested my soil. I just always try and put my chicken manure on it and my worm castings on it and things like that. So this is all going to be brand new for me. I've always been like a very successful vegetable grower though. So I'm hoping I can even just take it to the next level.
Great. Thanks for joining today, Maddie. And Elizabeth.
Can you hear me, Rachel?
Yeah, I got you now.
Okay, it was still on the headset microphone, but yeah, no, I'm a seed technician with Bayer Crop Science, but it's getting a better understanding of the soil tests and what we're reading for fertilizer input. It's also a refresher from when I was in college, but otherwise, like we also have our family farm out in Creston, so it's also understanding for that purpose. So.
Excellent. Thanks for joining today. And Alex.
Hey, my name is Alex Posmet. I live in Grand Forks, and we run a fairly large farm. I've been here for almost 2 years with the family, and we raise sheep and chickens, and that's about it right now. But and lots of hay. So, but I've never tested the soil, and I just want to get it. It's varied. It's like gravel and low-lying stuff. So it would be nice to know.
Excellent. Thanks for joining today, Alex.
Thank you.
Terry Chow.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Let's see if I can turn my camera on now. Oh, come on. Oh, my camera won't come on. Whoops, I just lost you two.
Oh, we got you. We can see you and hear you.
Oh, I can't see you. Anyways, hi. I don't know if you can see me. I can't even see myself here now. Yes, I'm a professional agrologist, and I used to live in the Kootenays, but I live on the coast now. I used to have a small orchard in Creston, and then I had some acreage in Cranbrook. But my interest in soil testing is that I'm involved in North Saanich District, which is a rural community with many farms, and there's concerns about toxic runoff from adjacent urban areas. So that's why I'm interested in soil testing. Thanks.
Excellent. Thanks for joining today, Terry. And it's fun to have you back on the old stomping grounds near Creston, where you once had an orchard.
Yeah, thanks.
And Tom.
Hi, my name's Tom Brownable, and I work for Kiefer Ecological. I mostly dealt with forest soils over my career, but now I'm getting, well, not dragged in, but very cheerfully involved in some restoration projects which have questions around soil fertility. And so helping me deal with interpretation of soil tests would be real helpful.
Excellent. Thanks and for joining today, and great to have another member of the Kiefer team here with us today. And last but not least, Nicholas.
Hi, I'm a ways away from everyone. I'm actually an intern with James River Soil and Water Conservation District in Chesterfield, Virginia. So I just joined because we have lists of different webinars and stuff we can do to learn more about the subject. So I'm trying to familiarize myself with some things, and then also I'm getting into gardening myself. So I figured anything I can take from people of knowledge is useful.
Excellent. Thanks for joining all the way from Virginia. Well, you definitely get the prize for the furthest participant. So, it's really fun. Thanks for doing the roundtable introductions. It really helps us coordinators and presenters know who we're speaking to. It makes these virtual events a little bit more personal, and it does help contextualize the presentations as well. So thank you for doing the roundtable. And without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Jeff Nimmo. Thank you.
Thanks, Rachel. Oh, I'll just get sharing again. Coming through?
Loud and clear.
Great. Well, thanks, everyone. Exciting to see the breadth of interest and experience in soil so far. So it should be hopefully some interesting discussion towards the end. I guess just as a slight introduction, so I work with the BC Ministry of Agriculture as a regional agrologist. So my main day job is not super soil focused all the time. I'm kind of a resource person within our area for farms, farm organizations, anyone within the Kootenay region. My role is that sort of front-facing side of the ministry. But all of the different regional agrologists, we all kind of have weird backgrounds that land us in these jobs in the different regions for whatever reason. And I happen to land here and bring a bit of a background in nutrient management, was what I did with the ministry before. So how we use fertilizers and manure, and And yeah, my original kind of education and training, I did grad studies in looking at how we integrate livestock into farms and what that does to the different soil resources and overall nutrient balance of them. And so that was a pretty exciting topic for me. And at the time when I started, I really didn't know much about soil. And one of the reasons I dug into that was because I'd been working with inputs to farms and didn't have that background to understand why you're doing what you're doing. And so yeah, developed a lot of that sort of background on the East Coast, actually, in Nova Scotia, but eventually landed back here, and happy to kind of share some of that information here today. Our topic was soil testing 101. So I'm going to really try and keep it fairly introductory, which sometimes I get a little carried away. So if I start on a tangent and you are just completely lost, please feel free to raise your hand in Zoom or just unmute yourself and say, hey, can you slow down or provide some extra context on a topic. But hopefully this will be mostly just introductory, getting yourself familiar with why you might want to do this. And yeah, we're always excited when people are interested in the topic, because it really is just a foundational thing that for understanding where things are at on your farm, soil testing is a great place to start. So I'll see if I can move some slides. Okay. And really, it's a good fit with one of the larger priorities that's been mandated for our ministry in the last little while, positioning BC as kind of a showcase or a leader for regenerative agriculture and the adoption of practices that are all focused on maintaining and building soil health is one of our priorities. And so there has been a shift in some of our programming to try and reflect that, and as well just emphasizing existing stuff within some of our programs like the EF Environmental Farm Plan. So really trying to showcase how farmers and people that steward the land can really foster soil health. And so often when people think of soil health, there is quite a focus on soil carbon as well as just biological activity and how we maintain that. But we do really always want to emphasize that having an understanding of what's going on in soil is pretty fundamental to being able to maintain soil health. And testing your soil is a really good component of your overall management strategy. When we talk about soil nutrients and nutrient availability, it really takes that type of understanding in order to be able to help yourself move along in terms of soil health. And often some of those limiting factors that you might identify in soil testing can be one of the steps towards building healthier soils. It's not always earthworms. Sometimes some of those just fundamental nutrients or chemical properties of your soil can really be a factor in helping yourself build up capacity in terms of soil health and quality. So definitely sort of a background topic for here today. And when we're thinking about how testing fits in, I like to kind of go back to some of the real basics of understanding soil. And so there's two diagrams here on this page, and one of them is trying to kind of poke at what soil is. And I think a lot of the times if you're new to agriculture or new to soil, often when people think of it, it's really the physical, what you can touch and see in soil that you think of as the main composition, and that tends to be what we think of as what is the mineral particles within soil. So the actual sands or silts that make up the soil composition. But when we're talking about broad soil management, it's not just that mineral composition. It is the overall sort of matrix is what's referred to when we're talking about it, of air, water, the minerals that make up the soil, as well as the organic matter that's in there, helping them all hold together and really driving a lot of the functions within the soil. So overall, it's important to remember that soil is all of those things, not just the minerals. And when we think of testing, it's one of the options that we have that can help assess some of the components within soil. And so it's a nice way to kind of slice through a bit of that and get a readout of what's going on in there. There's also the other kind of angle of thinking and understanding soil is that it's really a unique part of kind of our environment where you have you've got sort of aqueous solution, you've got air, and then the mineral particles themselves and all the interactions that are happening between all those things that creates a lot of interesting sort of environments for different types of organisms to thrive. And in all soils, there's biological interactions going on, there's physical properties and there's chemical properties that help sort of define what's going on within that space. And so it's really important to remember that if you're thinking soil management, you really do want to be thinking about what's the physical characteristics of the soil. Is there really good structure? How does it hold together, and how does it sort of work when it comes to, if you apply water to the soil, how does water move through that? And that's so that kind of relates to some of the physical parameters that you want to be thinking about. And then biological is all the organisms that thrive within the soil and what they do for nutrient cycling within, say, your own farming system, but also the broader environment. And then sort of between those things, there's chemical interactions that are going on. And the sort of sweet spot in the middle of that Venn diagram, I think, is often where the topic of soil quality and health lands, because providing, if all of those things are working well in harmony, then you probably have quite a healthy and a good quality soil. But one of the really tricky things is trying to figure out how to assess all of that. And soil testing will get at some of this, but not all of it. And so it is a super useful tool to understand where you're at in terms of soil management, but I think good to recognize that it's not going to inform you about all the physical properties of your soil. It won't, depending on what tests you run, it won't inform you of all of the different biological interactions. Some of the indicators you get on a soil test, you can make inference about some things, but within the biological realm, but it won't get you the entire way there. So soil testing represents one strategy or one sort of opportunity to learn more about what's going on, but it won't fill sort of the entire box. So it is something we want to really encourage as a sort of, it's often the entryway point for, I think, a lot of people when they're looking at understanding soil, but it's not the be all end all, but definitely one that will give you some options to move forward in management. And especially when you're starting out, it's really nice to have a tool that allows you to kind of take action, and ideally a soil test will do that for you. So just kind of what we'll go through today in terms of topic. Wanted to go through, there's different approaches that you can take to soil testing depending on what your objectives are. We'll talk about some general ones there that you might be thinking of. And then based on that, have a look at our sampling methodology and what tools you might be thinking of using. Via Zoom, probably won't, it's, you know, not, I won't do a demo here or anything, but if you're interested, I believe we've got a video online, and really just, you can do some internet exploration yourself if you're looking for some of the really how to literally do some of this, but we'll go through some of that methodology. Then talk a bit about sort of the different analyses that you can do on a soil sample, and start to get into what the results actually mean. And I'll use some example tests to highlight some of that. I think with our, ideally with our time frame today, probably won't go too far down every part of a soil test result. And I did want to kind of dig a little bit into it, but then maybe leave some space at the end for if there was a portion of a soil test that you're particularly interested in, wanted to discuss, maybe we can save that for the Q&A, but or just another date. So we'll dig into this. Pun intended. So how we use soil testing, really there's often a few different purposes that you might be driving at. And so sometimes it's a diagnostic tool. So if you are, if within your crop you've got specific problems and you're narrowing that down to something that you suspect is a soil related issue, then testing is an option to try and diagnose that. And so that's a really sort of focused use of soil testing. And so that comes with sort of a slightly different set of methodology than if you were looking to use soil testing for something like planning for crop needs. And so what I'm talking about there really is if you're thinking of using a soil amendment like fertilizer, compost, how do you decide how much of that to apply, or what is sort of a good amount of that material to use for the crop, and what will it need? And so soil testing is one of the fundamental things that can be used to inform that. And I do work with the province and the Ministry of Agriculture, so I think it is probably in my space to be open about. There is a regulation actually in place that if you are going to use amendments like fertilizer on your crops, there is an expectation that you do inform those rates with soil testing. And so it's gotten to the point where it's just seen as a fundamental thing that farmers should be doing in order to use those materials, because there can be environmental downsides to using too much of some of those things. So if you're looking for more info on what sort of that is, I didn't want to get into regulation today, so just will at least highlight that there's some obligation there. And then monitoring, and this kind of fits with that concept as well, that whether it's that sort of, I want to know right now what to apply, or just from an overall perspective, you want to keep tabs on how the entire system is working. There's definitely value in doing regular check-ins with your soil testing to see if there are trends, or if you can observe differences over time based on the management practices that you've been implementing. And so that might not necessarily be about an immediate how much fertilizer do I need to apply, but it might be from the bigger picture, where do I want to change some things in order to shift some of the characteristics of your soil. So depending on what approach you want to take, it might affect how you want to sample, or how you're going to plan sort of your schedule of these things. And ideally, it'd be nice if you can hit a couple of these things at the same time. And so often you can kind of get some monitoring and planning for crop needs done at the same time. So it's not that you need to do a whole bunch of different timings for soil sampling all the time. Ideally, you can kind of get some win-win testing done. I guess before digging too far into this, did want to just sort of start with a real basics. When I refer to the sample, really generally that's the sort of end point of this process, or what you would be packaging up to send to the lab for analysis. And so that sample that is kind of your unit of measure, or what you're going to be measuring, it should actually be a composite of multiple subsamples of soil. So it's not that you just go out, dig with a shovel, pack it up, and then send it off. The idea here is your sample should represent the specific area of interest, or that sampling zone that you're working with, to better understand. And in order to get that sort of representation of that area, it requires taking subsamples throughout it. And so we'll talk a little bit about sort of the methodology behind that, but did just want to reinforce that the sample is actually sort of made up of a bunch of smaller things. And today, just as sort of the introduction to soil sampling, I'll focus mainly on sort of the most common strategy, and we won't, which is that sort of a sample that's representative of a specific area by sort of randomly sampling throughout it. We won't get to, there are other sampling strategies that can be used, and often these are employed when you have really large areas that you're trying to get a better understanding of, or if you're delving into something like precision ag, where you're making decisions on a much more sort of area by area basis. So we'll keep it pretty general today. And really, if you're going to pay for a lab to analyze your sample, and it's a cost, especially if you're doing a bunch of samples, you want to make sure that you're giving them the best starting point that you can actually give them, and the accuracy, or the value that you get out of your sample. Probably one of the biggest things that will influence that is how you actually take the sample, and how well you understand what that's kind of representing for you, because that allows you to make value out of what you're interpreting from the results. So always remember that if you're crunched for time and you really feel like, I just need to get it done, and kind of cut corners on sampling, then it probably, you're kind of shooting yourself in the foot by mailing that off to the lab and just flying at it. making sure that you have a good approach to sampling, that you handle the samples properly, and that there's kind of a good chain of custody up to the point where the lab takes over, it really will help give you valuable results at the end. So, yeah, trust in your own management at that point. So we'll go through what areas that you want to take the sample from, where to take the cores within that area, or how to approach that, and how many to take. When you actually want to be thinking about taking the sampling, because that really affects how you, what approach you can used, and how you interpret the results, and roughly what depths to take soil samples from, because depending on where you are, there's a lot of soil down there. And some people have really shallow soils, some people have really deep soils. And so depending on what your objectives are in sampling and what you want to get out of the analysis, then that should inform how deep you're extracting your soil samples from. So all of these things are important things to figure out when you're approaching soil sampling and deciding what to take a sample from. I'm going to take a pause because I feel like I'm rushing. All right. Starting off from that list is sort of what area to take a sample from, or how to sort of delineate what I would sort of a technical way of thinking about would be like your sampling zone, or the area that you're taking your soil sample from. And so ideally, you want to group like things together. And so if you're going to take a soil sample, you want to try and make sure that it's representative of an area with similar crop, soil type, and management. And that's a lot of, like, when you break those things down, that's actually quite a lot of variation. The crop thing is fairly, I think, makes sense for most folks. You know, especially if we're talking annuals, or it's fairly a good delineation for people to wrap their brains around. But something to think about is, especially if you're talking perennials, and there's variation within varieties, so different varieties behave very differently. Then also there's sort of the age of crops really influences the way they work, and the way, sort of where you're at in your overall management. And so depending on your ability to subdivide different areas, do give some thought to that. Not sort of all crops with the same name are going to be at the same stage on your farm. So the other thing that really influences a soil is the soil itself. And so if you actually have variation in the types of soil on your farm, having a good understanding of that will help you decide if you need to differentiate between those areas with sampling. And so the ministry does have a way to access all of the soil maps online. If you're interested, can fire off a link, maybe with the follow-up email from the webinar, but it's called the Soil Information Finder tool. It's basically like Google Maps, but it has all of the soil surveys overlaid onto it. So it is an option to try and get a sense of, are there likely differences in soil types on your farm? Otherwise, if you've been farming a space for a while, you probably have a pretty good sense of if there's areas that have different soil texture or that drain really differently. It probably is going to give you a sense of if you've got big variation within the soil. You can also sometimes see it if you've cultivated a big area. You can see variation in soil types, sometimes just from differences in color or the way something dries out. So having a sense of that will help you inform if you want to consider breaking up sampling areas based on soil type, because the actual, especially if you have differences in the clay content or the organic matter content within the different soils on your farm, that can really create differences in the nutrient analysis that you would get from a soil test. And then management. So especially if you're doing things like irrigating some areas and not irrigating others, over time, that's really going to drive big differences in the soil community under the ground. And so those types of management things, even if you've got forage, if you're treating it differently, then you want to, over time, you want to sort of separate those out as different areas to sample. And same goes for nutrients. If you're fertilizing things at different rates over time, you want to establish those as differentiated areas. So once you overlay all those kind of factors of of potential differences on your farm, you could end up with a pretty intimidating number of sampling areas. So try and figure out which ones are likely going to drive the biggest differences for you in what you'd find in the soil, and then also what you want to use the soil testing for should help inform, you know, how many different sampling zones you would establish. There's always the ideal of what sort of agronomy and the science behind this would recommend, where you had that perfect, you know, you've subdivided out by soil type, the cropping fields that are sort of laid on top of that, and then also areas where you're managing things differently. And so that ideal might mean that for some people, they're looking at 20 different soil sampling areas, but that might not be practical for some folks. So figure out if you're going to have to make some sacrifices there. Ideally, figure out ones that will lead to fewer differences or fewer kind of problems, or introduce less variation if you're going to have to make some of those sacrifices, because there's always the best option that you can go for, and then the one that maybe is the more practical or something that fits within the budget that you actually have for this. So that info should help you decide where to sample from. Within a specific sampling area, ideally you'll be taking about 15 to 20 cores of soil from that area to represent it. And generally that sort of, you know, within our sort of recommendations or guidelines, your sampling area ideally is up to about 10 hectares, or that's about 25 acres, which depending on where you are is not a very big field. And so in theory, you know, the reason where that sort of guideline comes from is that once you start looking at a larger area, you're gradually introducing more and more potential variation within there. And so the ability to have good representation of a larger area just starts to drop. And so it's partly just be aware that, you know, if you are increasing that field size up and up and up and not increasing sort of your ability to get good representation of that, the accuracy of your results might be dropping as well. And so, you know, if you are an approach is just starting to, you know, increase sample size or the actual subsample sizes to try and address some of that increases in potential variation, or else look at, is there different approaches to soil sampling that you might take in order to better understand that, in order to understand that area. So that's the general sort of unit of sample area that we look at. So this is kind of a really sort of simplistic thing here where we're looking at if someone has, you know, uniform forage fields from, if you were just sort of doing a drive-by or looking at an aerial photo, if there's green here with established perennial forages and then silage corn, you know, from a bird's eye, there are established sort of field boundaries, but without some more information, it might be difficult to decide how many sampling units to take here, because it might not be necessary to sample each of these forage fields separately if they are of uniform characteristics. So it's important to figure out if you can or can't group things. And the way to do that would be to just look at, you know, are there similarities or differences between those forage fields and how big they are, because maybe they're really large in size. But if we're talking about, you know, a really small area, maybe it's possible to sort of group these. And so looking at the topography and the actual soil composition of those would help inform if you can group it. What the actual age of the forage stand is, because I think I mentioned before, it would, you know, if it's an establishment year versus something that's, you know, 4 years in, it can be a really different soil composition there. And then, yeah, if there's other management factors like drainage or the way it's irrigated, if it's differently, or if it's done differently, then should start to introduce the thought that you might need to break this up and take different samples for the different fields. So one of the areas where that approach, or that sort of like simplistic version where you're talking like this field has this crop in it, starts to fly out the window is when we deal with intensive vegetable management, or you know, market gardens that have a lot of different crops in a small area. And so we're not talking about fields, we're talking about portions of rows, and especially when you start to have, you know, multiple crops throughout the season on different portions of these rows, it adds a whole layer of complexity that really simplistic kind of sampling, like defining your sampling area guidance is kind of hard to apply. But in general, if you can kind of break it or peel back the core concepts there, you want to be sampling areas that ideally have similar management history and similar things that will affect the soil underneath. So if you can find alignment with how you wrote, usually like at some point when you establish a crop rotation for intensive management like this, you probably grouped things together or you're timing things for certain reasons. And a lot of those reasons are probably really similar to why you would want to sample or soil sample those things together. So try and find alignment with your crop rotation and crop groups to match where you might establish your sampling zones. And a lot of times people do group things according to sort of some of their nutrient demand or the sort of families of vegetables that all have similar growth habits and duration throughout the season. So it does, essentially it's figuring out what areas you can group together and sample as a unit. So it's instead of sampling all of your different lettuces, kales, small mixed sort of brassicas, maybe there are opportunities to group a bunch of those things together and sample them in sort of coordination. And so I think the other thing on this one I was also just going to mention is just what's your budget for soil sampling? Because that really will, you know, if you don't have a budget for 10 soil samples a year, then that's going to affect how you look at where you'll soil sample and when you'll soil sample. Because if you've already started to impose differentiation among your crop rotation and how you're treating some of that space, then you probably want to start going down, breaking or dividing those areas up into distinct places to sample, as opposed to certain stages of the year where maybe you have cultivated and things are in a more uniform state. It introduces an opportunity to maybe do less sampling. Just recognize that if you are using very different inputs and strategies across a smaller area, then you might expect really a lot of variation within that sort of, if you've got, say, an acre of market garden and you've had intensive management on one side, a crop that was in place for the entire year and didn't have high nutrient demand, it introduces potential for variation across that. And if you know you've got those differentiated spaces through a field, it may, if you can't divide those up into different sampling zones, which probably would recommend, if you can't do that, just be aware of that. It might mean increasing the number of subsamples you have and really trying to make sure that you're getting good representation across the whole area and not focusing too much on an area that might bias your results. So it's always a matter of, if you can't do the best thing, just at least be aware of where you're losing some of your accuracy and some of the sort of benefit. So, because I think that is often one of the sort of stuff or reasons people get a little intimidated with soil testing if they are working in that type of operation is if you follow the theory in every recommendation in a soil textbook on how to soil sample, it probably would recommend doing a very intimidating number of samples for those growers. So it's not about that it's not at all worthwhile. It's just figuring out where you're potentially going to have sort of losses in your precision due to that variation. So that's generally that sampling area and how to where to take those samples from. But within that space, you then need to take up all the different sort of subsamples that will make up your composite soil sample. And ideally, you want to try and randomize this, because if you introduce too much of a biased approach, you might end up sort of not adequately representing that space. And so the really simplistic version of this is to essentially just zigzag through that space at intervals, stopping and taking your soil core from the ground. And so a zigzag is kind of that approximation of, or a zigzag transect through your field is just a way to approximate random sampling. But one of the things that we do just kind of provide as a caveat here is, before you start that process, is identify parts of the field that you know might introduce a really big sort of bias to the sample if you take a sample from them. And some of those areas might be something like, if you have, if over the years you often use a certain portion of your field to temporarily like store the compost that you then spread on the field, that spot is probably going to have a different nutrient composition because a lot of that will have trickled down into the soil there. That spot will have a different nutrient composition than some of the other spaces. And so you want to avoid spaces like that. As a note, try and switch that spot up through the, every year if you are doing that practice. Don't use the same spot all the time. Or else if you've got sort of depressions within your field. So if there's sort of topography that means that you've got sort of this one area that's always low lying, water often collects there. It may actually have quite a different soil composition within that depression as well. If you've got something like that within the field and it's a bit of an isolated thing, then you don't want to, if your random zigzag happens to land you there and it's an oddball out, just don't take the sample there. If otherwise, things like headlands or areas where there's a lot of traffic, the alterations to soil structure that happen in those spaces really affect a lot of the chemical and biological stuff going on within the soil. And so those spaces tend to be a little different. Field edges always look a little different from what's going on a little bit more internally. And that's something that over the years gradually changes soil composition. So just be aware that, if the quick approach of just driving around the edge of the field, walking 10 feet in and taking samples, you're really quickly going to introduce a pretty strong bias into how you're sampling. So make sure you kind of take the time to get in there and do that. If you do have different timing, okay. If you do have different sort of crop, like if it's not just a sort of open field and you've got different types of crops like perennials and rows, it's going to affect where you take soil samples from. And so if that's the case, we do have a sampling guide online that outlines where you actually take the cores from in some of those more permanent bed systems, or if you're using things like banded fertilizer. So maybe if you want to follow up on that, I'd really encourage you to have a read through the sampling guidelines that are online, and there's a printable version of that you can print off as well. It's pretty helpful. Okay, otherwise, typically it's really nice to be able to take your soil samples themselves with a probe, or an auger, which is just sort of like especially if you have more dense or compacted soils that are tougher to get through. An auger is really helpful to dig down through that. And so the benefit of these tools is that it gives you an even portion of soil for all the different depths that you go down through. So you're not getting sort of a V shape where you might have a lot of soil from the upper, say, 2 centimeters of soil and then gradually decreasing down to the bottom of your little hole that you dug, where you'd have a really small portion of the soil coming from, say, 6 inches down. So a probe or auger will give you that nice even distribution, but not everyone will have that, and you can use a shovel. And so essentially, if you're using a shovel for soil sampling, just be conscious of that. The different chemicals and nutrient composition within the soil varies at depths. So you want to try and capture an even amount of soil from each depth. And so the way to do this, there's kind of some little diagrams here, but essentially dig a hole first, and then give yourself a nice even plane of soil down to the depth that you're going through, and then take a slice off that plane or off that face of soil, and make sure you're taking equal amounts from the different depths that you're digging to. So depending on what your objective is, it'll influence when you sort of approach soil sampling or when you want to actually take these samples. So I mentioned off the bat, there was that kind of diagnostic sampling that you can do, where typically what the approach there is you've got an area of the crop or of the field that isn't performing well, and you think there's something going on with the soil that's causing a problem. And so you would define that as a sampling area and take a soil sample from it. And then if you've got a good portion of that crop that isn't having the same problem, you're sort of pairing it with the good and the bad, so that you can see if there's a difference in the soil within these two spaces that might be causing that problem. And so that's kind of the approach of diagnostic sampling. You investigate the bad stuff and you compare it with the good. And do make sure, though, that you do this at the same time. So just because you have a soil sample from a few years ago when things were going well, over time things can change, and depending on when you took that throughout the season, stuff will change. So if you are doing diagnostic, make sure while you're doing that sampling, you do both the good and the bad. Don't just use sort of a historical good. when you're looking to plan for, say, how much compost to use or how much fertilizer your crop is going to need, those decisions on what to apply can be informed by your soil test. And there's kind of a couple options there. Really, the most common one being before you're going to apply it. And so spring pre-plant sampling is a really common practice where you'd look at sampling before planting or sampling before some of those amendments need to go on to tell you what you should do. And so it gives you sort of the closest, the most up-to-date information. Fall, if it is, you can use some of the results from a fall soil test to inform your next season decisions. But the challenge there is that it does limit your ability to interpret the nitrogen, because nitrogen on a soil test really varies with season. And so if you're looking at fall numbers on that front, they're not going to be the same but when it comes springtime. So the reason I've just included fall on sort of planning for crop needs is because often when we look at soil monitoring, fall is kind of a good time to approach it. And so if you can kind of combine monitoring and planning for crop needs, it's really a nice sort of approach that that gives you a fair amount of meaningful information. But just be aware that, you know, if you're taking fall samples, you're going to have to adjust how you interpret nitrogen later on. And if you're monitoring for what's going on within the soil, fall is a really great time because it allows you to have usable information on the nitrogen front in terms of what went on throughout the previous season and where you're sitting at the end. I think for both planning for crop needs or for monitoring, the main thing though is to just be consistent. If you start a schedule of soil sampling in fall, stick with that so that you can make comparisons from year to year. Same thing if you're using the spring approach, you should be comparing with other spring soil samples because there is seasonal effects on the different chemicals and things that you measure within soil. So one of the reasons there's a bit of a mess there is that nitrogen is a challenging thing to measure within soil. And it's also one of the most influential nutrients in terms of plant productivity. So so it does introduce some fun when it comes to soil sampling, I would say, and understanding and interpreting results. By fun, I guess I just mean more work and less certainty. So if you're pre-plant sampling in spring, you know, you get the most up-to-date information, but just understand that the nitrate that you measure in spring is really only a portion of what you're going to expect to become available throughout the season. So it does give you a sense of this is here now and probably going to be available for the crop in the coming weeks, but you're still going to need to do some estimate work to try and understand how much nitrogen will be available through the rest of the season. So it gives you sort of a portion of what you might expect. Whereas fall sampling, you know, the measured nitrate that you get on a sample from that will inform how well things went through the past season. So, you know, there's a certain level of expectation for what soil nitrate should be at end of season when crops have stopped to take up nitrogen from the soil. Because naturally, most of the soils within our province are really like nitrate is a scarce element or of nutrient within the soil typically. Unless you're in really heavy organic soils, we don't expect a ton of nitrate to be floating around. That's not really the natural state for most sort of mineral-based soils. So having an understanding of where you're at end of season is a really helpful tool. But you know, if you do fall soil sampling, and it does mean that you're going to essentially have to estimate most of your nitrate availability for the following season. And as I said before, just be consistent. If you're picking fall or spring, just stick with that measure, and that's what you're comparing to. So rather than comparing, unless you're doing both, rather than, you don't want to mix up your comparisons because it reduces your ability to understand what's going on. The other sort of variable that I mentioned was around how deep to sample. And I mentioned that within the soil, at different depths, there's different things going on. And that's different types of biological activity, chemical processes happening. And the result of a lot of that is that nutrients sort of concentration and behavior is different at different depths. And so if you had a soil under a perennial crop where there's not a whole lot of disturbance going on, a lot of the times it over time builds up that differentiation where, especially if you have the surface applied nutrients on the top, some of them will move down through the soil quickly, others will stay really close to the surface. And that gradually introduces, you expect higher concentrations of things like phosphorus shallower in the soil, whereas some of the other nutrients like nitrate that is not held tightly within the soil and moves really easily with water, it'll move downwards through the soil profile with any amount of excess water. And so depending on what you're trying to analyze, you might want to hit different depths. The general recommendation for something like, if you're just planning for crop needs, is you can sample down to about 6 inches, and that'll inform or give you good information to use for, say, if you want to apply compost or fertilizer. And so if you cultivate a lot and the soil is mixed, and so if you know that you have really frequent sort of mixing of soil, and then sampling down to that sort of cultivation depth can achieve that sort of similar thing, because that tends to be a fairly uniform sort of sample of soil that you'd be pulling from. Otherwise, if you're looking to capture nitrate within your soil test and have a good understanding of how much nitrate is within your soil, sampling deeper is something that's essentially needed. And so the bare minimum here really is down to a foot if you're trying to get a good understanding of nitrate. In some area, it does go deeper than that within the soil if it moves with soil water. But for most purposes, especially going deep requires a lot more effort, often requiring sort of mechanical assist, or there's hydraulic soil sampling equipment that you can use if you do need to go that deep. But and so there's on the slide here, it's kind of a few different approaches that you can use. At the end of the day, if you're trying to do all this at once, it probably means taking 2 distinct soil samples for your sampling area to represent these 2 different depths, because you don't want, if you aren't cultivating down to a foot, which is pretty deep for cultivation, if you aren't mixing down at that level, the soil deeper down likely is much more dilute in terms of some of the nutrients that are really important for plant productivity. And so if you try and take too deep of a soil sample and send that in for some of the basic fertility analysis that you'd expect to use for crop recommendations, that's essentially you've diluted a lot of the nutrients that are within your sample with that deeper soil. And the result would be that you might get a recommendation of needing more nutrient inputs, even though maybe if you'd taken a shallower sample, it would have reflected that sort of higher nutrient content that's actually present within your soil. And most of the recommendations that have been developed for, if you have this soil test phosphorus value, how much fertilizer is needed for that crop, a lot of that fundamental science that was done to develop those recommendations was done on that sort of upper portion of soil. So again, just sort of be careful about digging too deep with your soil sample. It might bias you towards recommendations of higher nutrient inputs. So I think we're at a point where if we're walking through this process of how you're collecting your soil samples, you've figured out your area, you've figured out when you want to take that soil sample, you've got an approach for collecting all the cores throughout that area to make up your composite sample. You know how deep you're taking that sample from, and you've done all that. Then you need to package it up and figure out where to send it off to. And so always a good idea to figure out where you're sending it to first and have a conversation with them to figure out if they have any specific submission forms. Some labs have recommendations on what to package it from, and if you talk to them in advance, they might actually send you some of their own packaging. So give them a call in advance. Something that when we're dealing with other folks collecting soil, if they're kind of new to it, is to definitely ask them like how much soil they want for the different analyses that you want to request, because a lot of them don't actually take very much soil, and so there's no need to ship huge quantities of soil through the mail to the lab. Most of them are probably only looking for about a cup of that sort of overall final sample that you're taking. And so the other thing to bear in mind when you're preparing samples and doing the actual sampling, on what analysis you're looking for, you might need to adjust things, or you might need to do things faster than others. So if you're looking to actually do nitrate analysis, so a good understanding of how much nitrogen is within your soil, it means you really want to try and do things fast and keep things cool. So same thing goes for if you're doing some of the assays on biological properties within your soil. Just because you've taken the soil sample out of the actual sort of ground does not mean that things are stopping. You haven't sort of introduced a stasis environment for that soil sample. Things will keep happening, especially if you if there's a sort of a decent amount of moisture within the soil, and then you put that in your car. You know, you're basically creating these sort of incubation conditions where it can actually accelerate some soil processes to, you know, you'd probably expect a gradual sort of increase in soil activity that might shift where some of the concentration of some of these nutrients might sit. So just be conscious of that when you're collecting soil samples, especially if you're doing measures on nitrate or biological things, that you'd probably want to have some coolers with you as you sample to keep things cool. And then if you're going to ship them off promptly. The other approach to avoid some of that hassle can be if you're sort of doing several days of sampling over a long period of time, do keep them cool when you initially collect them, but you can air dry those samples to sort of, what you're essentially doing is trying to slow down and stop the active processes within the soil. And once they're fully air dried, that can be sort of stored and then shipped off to the lab at a later date. With air drying, do just be careful. It's not just sort of putting your bucket on the counter, because it will take a long time for a really sort of dense soil sample to dry out. You need to spread out that soil sample over a surface so that it's gonna, you know, quickly dry out and then sort of slow down the processes that happen within soils. Otherwise, just again, just sort of like tips from things that do go wrong when you're sampling is figure out if you've got a good labeling system for your bags. If you're using sort of postage labels on plastic bags, those love to fall off those plastic bags. And so just be aware and have a system. If you're going to put all the effort in, you don't want to get back to home after sampling and find that a bunch of your labels have fallen off bags and you no longer know what sample is what. So make sure you've got a good system there for keeping track of what's from where. So that's sort of the approach to taking the soil sample, but ultimately you have to decide what you want to analyze from a soil sample. And so some of this would dictate your sampling approach, but just before we get to actually looking at sort of a lab result, I thought I'd kind of highlight that we're in an era where there's a lot more options now in terms of soil analyses than there used to be. So yeah, there's increasingly different types of analyses that can be run on soil samples. And I think the growing area of options there is often in that sort of biological realm and trying to understand more of what's going on within the biological properties of soil and the different organisms or indicators that can be used to assess that. And so if you're thinking about what for you will be of the most use, really do figure out what your objectives are. Why are you looking to do this? Is it really just that basic, I generally want to monitor what's going on? Is it that you have a very specific need and like you're spending a lot of money on fertilizer and you want to know how much is the right amount for a specific crop? And then also with a lot of the different types of analyses that are now available, I really do want to emphasize what the basis for interpretation is. Because just having a measurement is one thing, but being able to actually use that number is the sort of the most important part. Because if you aren't able to do something with that number and make a decision based on that number, it really, it can be interesting, but not necessarily something that will move you along in your journey of improving soil management. So being able to make use of that number and then where that interpretation comes from and having a good sense that that's coming from sound sound science, I would say. So have discussions with whoever's doing your analyses about how they're informing the recommendations, where that's coming from. ideally, there's an agronomist involved in that process somewhere along the way, and a lot of different, a lot of the different interpretations that are out there. It might mean gradually building up sort of your own bank of information. And so it's not necessarily that once you take that test, you're going to be able to refer to, something out of California that evaluates certain parameters within soil. It might mean that over time on your own operation, it might be 5 years before you can really make use of some of the different measures that are out there. And often that might be the most valuable approach to using some of the newer measures, where it's really probably just going to be about self-comparison rather than some of the reference values. So I have thoughts on some of these topics, so but maybe not for today's topic. So the test I'll show you is really probably just what most folks would consider as a traditional soil fertility test. And so what that'll include is things like the pH of the soil, the electrical conductivity of the soil, which is a measure of the salts that exist within there. And by salts, most of the chemical compounds that would exist within the soil fit into that category. And so that'll also include nutrient analysis. And so that is, for the most part, extracted nutrients that have been extracted from that soil sample, and very rarely does it report out on a total nutrient analysis, what you might expect to see on something like a manure analysis, which would have a total of something like phosphorus. Then most of these, in the sort of, if you're looking at different labs, they usually have sort of packages that you can order. And so most of them will include organic matter in that sort of fundamental soil fertility test. And then a lot of them will also use measure the cation exchange capacity and base saturations. Sometimes these measures are actually just, they're not necessarily analyzed, but they're inferred based on the extracted value of some of the nutrients. So if you are assessing which labs, it can be worth just checking like how they come up with something like the CEC and the base saturations. Is it, if they're charging you for it, are they just running it through a computer program, or is it something that they've actually done the lab analysis for, which for that measure, it can actually be kind of a complex one. So it should, if they're doing the measurement, it'll probably cost you more. And then other sort of add-ons or additional things that you might be that you can ask about would be soil texture. So understanding the exact composition of sand, silt, and clay within your soil really does, that's a super fundamental soil property or soil physical property that will influence fertility, the response to the different amendments that you're putting in, and things like how well things will hold water. So at some point, if you don't have a good sense of what soil texture is within your soil, or then it can be worthwhile to ask for that. And once you do it once, soil texture doesn't really change over time. So, unless, so you can, once you do it once, it's kind of a one-off. And then by default, not many labs will include buffer pH, but it can be an add-on that you add, which is, it gives you a sense of not only the existing pH within the soil, but sort of if you're looking to change pH with lime, what the sort of buffering capacity within your soil is to resist that change. So it's more of a management specific measure. The other thing that not all labs automatically do is micronutrients. And so you might have to add on a package for different micronutrients as well. Okay, I'm going to try and, I knew this would, time would be fun.
I'm wondering, Jeff, maybe because we are running out of time, we could fly. Yeah, I was going to say, let's look at some soil test results, because I have a feeling that some folks in our audience may have never actually even seen like a soil test result.
Yeah.
And so it's kind of fun to, now you've gone over like, what are those things we could test? Now we can say like, oh, what did numbers even look like? Yeah.
And so really, this is what a soil test report will look like. Different labs will all have slightly different variations on this, but for the most part, they have, at least the labels are fairly consistent. But I don't know if we've received any specific questions in the chat about like, I want to know about phosphorus measurement. Otherwise, I can launch into kind of like going through some of the different, like highlighting what some of these different measurements are and why interpretation of some of these should be different.
Yeah, I think that's great, Jeff. And, like if I could pretend that I was, for example, a lot of farms we work with question phosphorus levels. So I could be, Roslyn Market Gardener. I feel that phosphorus is a problem. So I go get a soil test because I'm worried that I have low phosphorus. And then I get this as a result. And I'm like, oh, great, 66 phosphorus.
Yeah. And so, which is, and phosphorus is, I don't know, it's one of the fun ones to pick on, I think. And so one of the, I think, things to bear in mind when you're looking at phosphorus numbers on a soil test is, so these are, and a weird distinction that you might hear when agronomists are talking about phosphorus in soil is they'll refer to soil test phosphorus. And that's because the number that's measured here is not the total phosphorus that sits within your soil. What you're looking at is a concentration that was measured on an extraction from the soil. And that extraction, the sort of chemical extraction that was performed, there's a bunch of different ones, and all the labs use different extractions, which makes things weird and complicated. But it's sort of, the idea is that it's trying to get a sense of what the potential availability of specific phosphate compounds are for your crop. And so it's this weird, it's not a exact measure of what's in soil solution now. It's not a total phosphorus. It's this sort of in-between value of potential. It's sort of like an index of potential availability is a complicated way to think about it. But what that means is it's a good thing to compare with reference data. And all of the phosphorus extractions are aligned with sort of what's, there's a whole slew of research that focused on, okay, if you, with this extraction method, if you got this result, if this is the crop you're growing, this is how it will react when you add a certain amount of phosphorus input. So it's sort of indexed to the use of inputs to improve plant performance. And so when we look at the rating for what some of these extractions, so like, do you have good, and so on this test report, you see there's a G and an H beside the phosphorus values. That's good and high. So what that's implying is they think the level of phosphorus is good or on this different extraction high, and I'll talk about the different extractions there in a minute. But so that means typically if you're at a good level, you shouldn't need much more fertilizer to grow sort of for optimal crop performance.
And I think that with those soil test interpretations, this is what really helps people who are just getting into soil testing, just those like the good or the high, that it gives us beginners like a sense of where I sit on that pendulum of if I'm deficient or whether I need to add some without knowing the background necessarily.
And increasingly, a lot of producers within our area are using the lab that this is from, this analysis. And they do, I think one of the fun, or what can be a confusing thing that this lab does is they actually use 2 phosphorus measures on all of their samples they receive. And the reason there is the different extraction processes that are used within the lab are kind of, a lot of them derive from different regions and where different soil types exist. And unfortunately, none of the labs use the extraction method that was developed, and the exact extraction method that was developed for all the BC standards. But so there's a bicarb extraction and a Bray extraction, and depending on where your pH is, that should inform which of these things informs your fertilizer decision. So typically Bray is associated more with acidic to neutral alkaline, or sort of acidic to neutral soils, whereas the bicarb measurement is often more for if you have a more calcareous soil or calcareous soil with a higher pH, then often that measure is the one that would be used to inform phosphorus availability. So unfortunately, A&L doesn't filter they just give you both, and so it's up to you to figure out which one.
Well, that's a good segue to say, okay, so what's my pH then?
Yeah, And when we're looking at a test report, that's you know, in my part 2, maybe we could do a list where I have slides on like the different nutrients. The start is, I think the best place to start is pH, because it should inform, it will affect the availability of all of your other nutrients, and it's just one of the fundamental values to look at. And so on this test, oops, the green circle that just popped up is pH, and so this is coming in at a fairly neutral level, which is, I believe this was a sample from the Canyon area near Creston here. And we do have, through our area, there are soils that are in that neutral, and in some areas a little bit more alkaline as well. So it's a bit higher than a lot of what you'd see on a lot of soil tests from different areas, but most crops sit really nicely in that slightly below pH of 7, and as you shift the pH either higher or lower, it really affects the availability of all of the other nutrients. And so I guess just as maybe it's something that I glazed over, for if we're starting at the true basics of what pH actually is, I kind of assumed we were jumping ahead there, but this really is just a measure of the acid, or sort of the amount of hydrogen and the acidity of your soil. So where it sits on the pH spectrum, which is a measure of essentially 1 to 14. If you're at 7, you're right in the middle, and that's sort of what's considered neutral. Whereas if you start to have a lower pH, where you move down to 6 or 5.5, you're starting to get into acidic soil conditions. Whereas you know, moving higher into the pH range of 8, 9, you're starting to get into really quite alkaline soils that, those usually are a result of the actual sort of the mineral makeup of your soil will affect what that pH is. Typically really low pH acidic soils will be related to higher, like really high, like essentially an organic soil that's derived mostly of decomposing organic matter. But
so if I was a market gardener, which it says that I am here, I would look across here and say, okay, my organic matter is 5.3. That's pretty decent. It says that my phosphorus level is good or high, depending on my pH. My potassium is very high. So I got my phosphorus, potassium looking pretty good. My pH is a little bit high, but I don't know, that's within range perhaps. And then, so those are my main ones except nitrogen, which, so we have our NPK. PKs are taken care of, but then my nitrogen is low. But as you alluded to previously, that's a hard one to grab in a soil test. And we could typically expect it to be low unless we're in, a high intensity crop situation where we're dumping fertilizer on all the time.
Yeah, and I always, the first thing that I look at when I'm interpreting the nitrogen number is the date on the soil test, and hopefully the date on the soil test aligns with when it was sampled. But we're looking at a September, it's probably too small for some folks there, but this soil test is from September. So towards end of season, a lot of, in most systems, you don't want a ton of nitrogen hanging around at end of season. That introduces potential for loss. Like if you don't have a strategy to capture that nitrogen at end of season with a cover crop, then it can trickle deeper down into the soil into a region that's potentially not accessible, or there's ways for it to be lost to the atmosphere as well. But I think one of the things that I often like, these reports will say low for nitrate, which okay, so and then that trickles down to there's a recommendation from this lab in terms of nutrient application. And so they've recommended a certain level of nitrogen application. And they do use some, this lab uses, I believe, some methods to try and estimate nitrogen availability. It's just a computer program that kind of applies a factor to the organic matter. But, there's a fairly decent amount of nitrogen recommended here for vegetable crops, and the actual rating of nitrate nitrogen here being low is it's just low at that point in time. Whether it actually would be like a nitrogen deficient soil year round, I would suggest looking at the results here, where we've got a pretty decent amount of organic matter. pretty high levels of phosphorus and potassium that to me indicate consistent, like someone's been amending the soil. It's not, most soils wouldn't have those levels if they hadn't been receiving decent amounts of probably organic amendments to see that level of phosphorus and potassium. So, I would, without knowing more, and you always need to know, like the context of a soil sample is always key for interpretation, but it suggests that chances are there's a decent amount of organic amendment going on, that you would expect good nitrogen availability and carryover from a lot of that from year to year. So calling nitrate low in September, in a way, it's like, well, that's actually kind of good, because it means they probably made good use of their nitrate through the season and are landing in a spot where they're not going to expect to lose some of it. And so, go ahead.
Well, I just for folks who are looking at this, we mentioned the soil fertility guidelines, and that's the second row down, just so folks are aware. I mean, it says soil fertility guidelines, but in case people didn't get that, and we have a couple questions in the chat, so I'm just going to kind of pace this along so we get there. But I just wanted to notice that when you look at the recommendations on the micronutrients, they kind of mirror what we're seeing in terms of the micronutrients in the soil test analyses, specifically the sulfur and the boron. And I just, maybe you can comment for a moment just on micronutrients and like the importance of measurement or amendments in relation to like sulfur and boron, which tend to pop up in our region a bit.
Yeah, and boron is like it's one that, depending on what your soil composition is, and some crops have higher demand, especially in the vegetable realm. You get into crops that require more of certain things like sulfur and boron. And this is like, I think they were given a generic market garden. So it's not, we're not talking about, if you're looking at onions or cabbages, the differences in those micronutrients, but so it's probably just a generic. We want to make sure there's roughly enough for everything. But yeah, depending on what your actual original soil makeup is, which is the result of millions of years of soil formation, you're going to be dealt a certain level of soil boron. And a lot of our cropping systems, the crops do have sort of a good need for it. And so often it's one that in your overall realm of fertilizers to be aware of. And the recommendations for boron, the province does have, I believe we've got a check on it, but it's pretty generic. Like, they're not super complex. It's pretty low levels of boron that are just recommended for a couple different categories of test results. So it's generally, if you're growing some of these things that do require boron, just apply a little bit of it on a somewhat regular basis, and should address that concern for you. Sulfur is one that it's a pretty interesting nutrient in a lot of low input systems. It has been, like, there's been some historic work in BC around forage responses to sulfur. And Mike, you might have even, I don't know if you were behind some of that on the call here, but it can be one of the limiting nutrients, because it's actually used in quite a large quantity by crops. And so so yeah, it is one to watch in terms of how available it is. There was a while where we actually saw a lot of sulfur deposition from the atmosphere. So naturally, because of essentially pollution that existed in the atmosphere, a lot of sulfur got deposited on soils, and it benefited crops for quite a while because it was providing a source of nutrients. And then as that has sort of tapered off, in some regions, it's become a little bit more apparent where the base level of sulfur was starting to limit things. And so there is, definitely certain crops where response to sulfur fertilizer is useful. It also is a little tricky to assess, because like nitrogen, sulfur is really tied up in the organic fractions. And so, depending on when your sample is from and what's going on within the soil, you'd expect to see pretty good variation in sulfur levels throughout the season.
Okay, thanks, Jeff. And I think that's super helpful. And I think that if people see deficiencies in these micronutrients, it's really helpful to get in touch with an agronomist, yourself, Kootenay Boundary Farm Advisors, to talk about, okay, if sulfur came back very low, do I actually have to add it? Like, where does this matter? So that's something where with those micronutrients, it's good to get in touch. with an expert. And I'm going to get to these questions so that we can get them before the end of the presentation. So where do you recommend getting the soil core probes from? I think Fraser Valley, there's probably lots of places, but around here anywhere?
Yeah, I don't know if Top Crop, I don't think they do. I'll have to check that. I haven't poked into Top Crop to see if they actually.
I'll get back because I'm blanking. So we'll get to you, Sarah, and we'll send that out in the follow-up.
Yeah, I know, like for our purposes, we always just order them online. And typically they run about, well, before the current set of increasing prices on everything, typically they would run about 80 to 120 for the real basic setup. But yeah, I haven't checked in the last little while to see where we're sitting there.
Yeah, thanks. And I'll send a link to something in our follow-up email. And this is relevant to this question, this screenshot we have right now. Is what is the target for soil test results? Do you want your result to come back as very high or high? And I think your answers have alluded to this in your explanation of this soil test result, but just, you know, commenting on where do you want to sit in that high, very high pendulum of nutrients?
Yeah, and I think it is important to bear in mind that the ratings are reflective of sort of sufficiency levels for fertilizer. So, so yeah, I guess it depends. It's probably, that's almost like a philosophical question, I think, in some ways. They aren't an environmental measure. You know, seeing high phosphorus, which phosphorus can be really a concern for the environment. Seeing high soil test phosphorus can be, you know, it is linked to total phosphorus, but it doesn't necessarily mean that we've got an environmental contamination problem going on. It's just a potential indicator in it. So,
and I think I would assume that this question is about environmental concerns generally on our small scale farms here are like minimum. It's like we lack fertility. So you're like budgeting and you're like, okay, I want to have enough phosphorus. I want to have enough potassium.
Yeah.
If I get a good back on my soil test result, do I have enough for my flower crop?
Yeah. And especially if you're using organic amendments, you know, phosphorus and potassium will gradually build up over time to a point like what you see on this soil test where we're into that high range. And then that you end up in a situation where, you know, you no longer need to apply those things in order to improve crop performance. But often, if you're using organic amendments, you don't get to pick and choose which nutrients you're applying when you apply your compost. You're applying a set sort of ratio of things to the soil. And so I think that is something to bear in mind, is that balance of your inputs and what's actually needed. Because maybe there's an opportunity to make better use of some of those inputs on a different field and just focus on, if you've gotten up to a point where you have really good levels of some of these nutrients, then you can use more targeted, maybe some of the more expensive nutrient applications, but targeted to address some of the deficiencies. But yeah, generally, if you're starting to see on your soil test that it says good or high, and the fertility recommendation is back to 0, you've reached a certain point where the soil is kind of providing most of what's needed, but you don't want to just stop at that point, because then you're essentially going to be mining back down, and really the extraction level is one thing, but the year-round availability of some of these things differs. So making sure that you have stuff available at the right time for the crop needs is the other thing.
Okay. Well, and here's another good one, Jeff, because we haven't touched on cation exchange capacity yet. And so this is always a good like next level question. So the question is, I know there's a calculation regarding the CEC, but I'm not sure as to what it pertains to and how it affects certain nutrients. So I'm going to give you 1 minute. This is a test, and outline maybe on the test if you have a little box to show where the CEC is there. Because I know the CEC can be a rabbit hole, but it's also very important for people to make that relationship between soil texture, CEC, and how your soil can or can't hold on to nutrients. So go, Jeff.
Okay, to start. Okay, so the cation exchange capacity, this is 101, so we'll start at the start. It's a measure of the different what are called exchange sites within the soil that have an opportunity to hold cations. And cations are the positively charged sort of ions of a bunch of the forms of nutrients. So your soil has a capacity to hold something like phosphorus, or it has a, so that's a bad example. It has a capacity to hold something like potassium or aluminum on some of these exchange sites. And so there's a measure that can be done to figure out essentially how much of that capacity your soil has to hold on to cations. And so that's just how, overall how much you have, sort of your potential holding capacity. But then the flip side of that is, okay, a lot of that is already occupied by the existing nutrients within your soil. And so in yellow here, you see what's referred to as base saturation. And so that's an indicator of where things are being held on or what portion of your exchange capacity is being held by different things. And so this will give you a sense of what's going on there. I think, as you said, it's a pretty complex topic. It's also one where there's divergent groups within the soil science realm as to how to make inferences about this and how much weight to put behind cation exchange capacity values versus some of the other extraction methods. But there is, oh, sorry, I think I highlighted the wrong thing on this slide. I didn't highlight the base saturations with the CEC. Sorry about that. Ignore where the yellow boxes are. Yeah, depending on how much of certain nutrients are within your soil, more or less of them will occupy those exchange sites. And if you have those exchange sites are kind of easily accessible, or they're one of the accessible places for crops to make use of nutrients. And so if it's dominated by certain nutrients, it means they might have trouble accessing others. And so, if you have a huge proportion of those sites that are occupied by something like sodium, it's going to reduce your availability of other cations. So usually there's sort of a balance there that you're looking for, and there are values for different soil types as far as where you want to shoot for the percentage of sites that are occupied by calcium.
Great, thanks, Jeff. It's a complicated subject, and we could YouTube video for days on CEC, but thank you for the 101. It's very an interesting part of interpreting soil test results and understanding soil properties and chemistry in general. So thank you. Yeah. Here's a question that I could probably answer. I'm a no-till flower farmer. This is Tracy. If organic matter is good at a level of 9, is there a reason to add anything more than a top dressing of composted manure for the coming season for crops? Or should I be adding a few inches as per the general rule of no-till farming? My answer to that is, wow, you have organic matter of 9. That's phenomenal for soil productivity and nutrient retention and soil water retention. It's great. I think the manure you would be adding for a top dressing, this is my interpretation of your question, is all you need for soil fertility management. And because I've done field days on no-till and everything, I think sometimes that few inches is the general rule for no-till often has less to do sometimes with nutrient management, but more for weed control, and you're managing for other things. So for soil fertility, you probably don't need to add a few inches if you have that, just a top dressing with your organic matter of 9. Jeff, anything to add there?
Yeah, I'd echo that. Flowers are a pretty low nutrient demand crop as well. It's not so. Yeah, just be aware that when you are adding a few inches of a compost amendment, you're adding a whole slew of different nutrients in different amounts. And if you're adding a few inches every year on a low input crop, just be conscious of what you're over time going to introduce. And maybe, if what you're actually looking for is that mulch effect, then maybe explore if there's other ways to accomplish that aside from just compost or manure.
Yeah, and it's Tracy who also asks, what happens if you lose nitrogen? I think you know, nitrogen is a mobile nutrient, meaning that it is, I'll get this right, negatively charged. Is that right, Jeff? Or sometimes nitrate is.
Nitrate, yes.
Yeah. So it kind of comes and goes to the soil profile. So if you're losing nitrogen, that's why you are adding your top dressing of composting every season, is to provide that boost to your plants. So what happens if you lose nitrogen? You're consistently adding those amendments to provide food and fuel for your plants. And there's two questions. I don't know which one to go first. I think I'll go for Dale's, just because this relates to the soil, where the soil testing labs are. And so Dale's in Golden, and he's like, what's the closest soil testing lab for me in the Golden area? I prefer a lab that has done other soil sampling from the Columbia Valley. And yeah, that's a hot topic too.
Yeah, so there aren't many, or there's options, but there's not many sort of close by options. So labs that actually perform the tests, like for instance, the one that you see on the screen here is actually from Ontario. So that, to give a sense of how far away that is. There are labs that have some of their analytical work that's carried out in the Lower Mainland. There's a few based there. Then I think, I can never remember if it's Edmonton or Calgary, Element has operations based there as well. And so, yeah, there's no really good close by options. If you're, some of the companies that provide advisory or fertilizer services within our region will sort of facilitate getting samples to labs if you're using their services. Otherwise, you know, pretty much no matter what, it's going to mean having to ship your sample into a lab. And so at that point, I would just recommend, it's really nice to be able to, like if you're in an area and you have sort of a farmer network, to know if everyone's using a certain lab, to stick with that. Because as I mentioned, different labs use different processes to extract a bunch of these nutrients. And so if you want to have a look and sort of get a sense of where other people are sitting, you want to be comparing apples to apples. So ideally, maybe check with some of the people that you do that type of conversation with, and see if they have a preferred lab. Otherwise, our ministry does have a list of labs on the website. I have an information slide with a web address on it that I can pop up at the end.
Yeah, and I have that list, the ministry list of soil testing labs as well, that I can circulate in the follow-up email. Yeah. And so testing for soil pH at home. Mm-hmm. How are those kits? How do you do that? Any confidence?
I mean, there's a few different kits that are like solution based, or else, you know, there's actual home tester, like little probes. I think the trick is having consistent approach to measuring it, and pH is one that even in lab. So like when I worked in a soil lab for a while, and even when you're in the lab and like testing repeatedly, it's one that does fluctuate a lot. Like there's quite a lot of variation. So it's nice to have a sample analyzed by a consistent process. So using a lab can give you that kind of certainty. They also sometimes will use, they'll measure not just in water, but in a solution that sort of is meant to stabilize and give a more sort of standardized reading. But I think if sending a sample off to a lab is a barrier for you and you have no idea what your soil pH is, then some information is better than that. So that can be helpful. You can also, there's also just sort of some tests of dropping a little bit of acid on your soil to see if you get a reaction to determine if you're into that calcareous zone. But otherwise, yeah, it's tough to get a good reading from some of those home kits, I find. But again, that like no information versus some information can at least get you down the process a little bit. Depending on the Ministry of Agriculture has a plant health lab that if you're having trouble with crops and submit plant health samples with soil along with it, they'll do some investigating and test pH on that as well for you. But otherwise, it's a pretty quick measure to do, and you can just request a pH measure on its own too from a lab. Is just a bit of a shipping cost and probably $10 to have them just analyze pH.
Okay, thanks, Jeff. And this next question is from Elizabeth. It's pretty big picture, but it's also interesting in terms of these kind of like a regional soil profiles. And this one is, can you explain on the relation between soil types and how this affects available nutrients? For example, in many areas in the Creston Valley, they're extremely low in selenium, and many farmers are needing to supplement animals with this nutrient. So that's like bigger picture.
Yeah, I mean that it gets back to that. Yeah, not all there's a bunch of different soils within the province, and we're it's unlike Alberta where they have like a few soil types that are predominant through the entire province. The variation in different soils in BC is pretty extreme. I think one of my slides at the start was the big pink thing was one of the old soil maps that shows all the different soil types that have been surveyed through the province. And those are a function of, you know, the formation of soil from the base minerals that were found originally. So over millions of years, that's gradually weathered. And then the vegetation over that time span that was on top of it, the different biology and chemical stuff that goes on. And so depending on where you are, you can expect to see quite different properties within the soil. Some of it is like that type of sort of profound micronutrient effect, where just based on the rocks that were weathered and what you've got, it will affect that availability. Otherwise, it's just some of the fundamental stuff of, you know, how much clay and organic matter you find within a soil really influences the way it behaves from a nutrient perspective and what you expect in terms of availability. So those have a pretty big effect on how you interpret and want to manage those soils. So it is really valuable to have a good understanding of what kind of soil you have. And yeah, if it's completely new to you, a good place to start is the soil maps, but they are just surveys. And it's always nice to know, to sort of ground truth that and actually do some exploration on the land itself to get a sense of what types of soil you might have.
Yeah, and that's where like neighborly relations and knowing the history of the area, like for example, in Creston, if everyone's giving their livestock selenium nutrients and stuff, that's like because that historic work has been done on the deficiencies that exist in the soil. And I think it's the same in the East Kootenay in regards to that selenium deficiencies. Here's a really interesting question because it's so foundational, but it is the foundation of a healthy soil, which is from Tracy. If soil is composed of 45% mineral particles, 5% organic matter, 25% water, and 25% air, how do we know if the water and air ratio is good?
Hey, I like that question.
Me too. Pores.
Yeah, and so this gets to like a soil test only shows you certain things. And sometimes, I think one of the slides that I skipped over there was like, sometimes just practical things will tell you, will help you inform assessing soil health and quality as well. And so Rachel mentioned pores, which is the space between all of the mineral and organic stuff within the soil. And that has a huge, like the way the soil is structured, so how the different minerals and organic stuff sticks together and then creates that negative air sort of pore space within the soil really influences the ability of a soil to have nice sort of chemical and biological processes as well. So there's a couple measures for something like that. And so like bulk density is really just, you know, how much weight of soil do you have within a given space will give you an idea of how densely packed your soil is. Otherwise, you know, once you get to like problems with that air and water space, really what we usually refer to as compaction within the soil is when you start compressing and losing that core space. And so if you have compaction problems, it's sort of it impacts the nutrient cycling ability of your soil, as well as water infiltration, a whole mess of things. And so you can assess that with So high tech would be a penetrometer where it just hydraulically measures how much pressure it takes to push down within the soil. But you can also just use, if you have a consistent measure, you can use, if you have a steel rod with a pointed tip, you can feel how hard it is to move through different portions of the soil and compare that with other spaces. So if you have a field, you can look at, say, a fence margin, which is probably pretty undisturbed, and assess what it takes to push through different portions of the soil. And then if you move infield and it's much more harder to move through, say, the 8-inch portion of soil, you're probably looking at a compaction layer that's related to some of your tillage practices or something. So yeah, that physical and evaluation of soil health is often something that I think is super approachable for people to do themselves, and really where you can assess a lot of really great properties of soil and get a sense of how well you're doing. So like that question.
Yeah, the physical properties. Well, thank you, Jeff. We did get through those questions there, which are fantastic. And I apologize, we don't have more time for questions right now. It's been a great discussion. Jeff, your presentation was great. Thank you for giving us a rundown. I feel that for someone like yourself who has so much knowledge about what a soil test can provide, what I received as well from your presentation is just, I think uncertainty is the wrong word, but there's so many factors that influence what results you receive back in a soil test, and you're very concise in explaining all those different variables that will influence what you get back on that piece of paper. And so to tread cautiously and lightly at each step that we're collecting a soil test. And I know we just scratched the surface on the interpretation side, but the Kootenay and Boundary Farm Advisors, the Ministry of Agriculture, Jeff are all here to help with those soil test interpretations. So if and when you do your soil tests, and you have questions, but what does this mean for your soil, your plant nutrient management and all of that, please don't hesitate to get in touch with us. And we'll be sending out this recording along with all the resources on how to test your soil and soil testing labs and all that stuff. We'll send that out probably by Friday or Monday. So thank you very much, everyone. And if you have more questions that come up, just send us an email. Jeff, any last words?
No, thanks, Rachel. Ideally, I would be able to rein in a little bit more and be more concise. Your summary there was a very nice way to put it. Please reach out. We're here to help people wade through some of these questions. And yeah, it's a pleasure to share some info. We do have a website up on the slide there that it's kind of the homepage for a lot of this content with the Ministry of Agriculture. So, there's info on different labs. You can, our sampling instructions are found there, as well as some online calculators that range from simple to complex. If you want to dig into how to interpret some of your soil test results, you can play around with some of those as well.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Jeff. And thanks everyone for your attention and coming out today. Bye-bye.